So the topic today is going to be medicine and Shabbos, and I coyly termed it Chil Shabbos Gilchasa. Obviously, a play on the famous Sefer Shmir Shabbos Gilchasa. Just to start, there's a couple of vignettes or cases right in the beginning, but maybe just a few words to open up about the attitude of Chazal about medicine and Shabbos in general. I think there's no better place to start off than the Orach Chaim. As we'll see, the sentiment of the Orach Chaim is one that's taken very, very much so within the Chabad canon, but also elsewhere in the Litvish canon as well. Just to start off, the pasuk says, "Es shebseisai tishmeru." There's an interesting addition that the pasuk, that seems to be a little bit extra. To explain that point, the Orach Chaim says, the reason that the pasuk gave a miyut there is to say that when you need to be mechal Shabbos for a chayla, it's not to say that this is really chil Shabbos, adrab, this is shmir Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch also says, has a similar sentiment in the beginning of Shin Chav Ches, which is the sim that deals with medicine and Shabbos, or the din of chaylim and Shabbos. He says that mishesh lechaylish lakana mitzvah lechalav Shabbos. Someone who is a chayla that their life is in danger. It's a mitzvah to mechal Shabbos for them. Hazariz harz meshubach vashoyel harz shayach damin. He who works fastest is praiseworthy, and he who asks questions, they're as if they murdered. This is something that I think historically, especially in the social world, has been there's a certain discomfort about it, and there's a beautiful link to a Rebbe video where the Rebbe kind of illustrates the classic discomfort that Chassidim had in general. But this shouldn't be a foreign topic for us. In the first Maimer that the Rebbe delivered, Basilagani, the first story of the Alter Rebbe really is about this topic. There was a Yeledes, there was someone who was giving birth. Her family was all at shul. And the Alter Rebbe, sensing that she wasn't being cared for, left Kol Nidre, chopped wood, and we all know the story. This seems to be something that Beis Harav was very passionate about. There's a beautiful sikha that's on page 2. Look at the sikha Chelek Chav Zayin, illustrating this point. He says that since the mitzvah of Shabbos is, Shabbos is really a phenomenon that happens between the Yid and time, between the Yid and the Eibishter. And without both of these things at play, Shabbos doesn't exist. So in the Rebbe's phrasing of it, when you're mechal Shabbos to save a Yid, it's not that you're being mechal Shabbos adar, but explaining the rationale of the Orach Chaim. It's not just these aren't just this isn't just an interesting pep talk, but he's really saying that on a fundamental level, by safeguarding the Yid, you're safeguarding something that's at least one side of the equation that's very important for the Shabbos phenomenon. In other words, you're keeping the Yid who's then able to keep Shabbos. Thereby, you are keeping Shabbos itself. Traditionally, there are about 5 gradations of what's considered a chayla in halacha when it comes to this and other topics. So the first is a chayla shesh b'sakana, someone whose life is in danger. Someone who's sakanas aver, their life isn't frankly in danger, but they have a limb or they have a function of a limb that is in danger. There's a chayla she'en b'sakana, someone who's sick. That's to say that they're incapacitated, but their life isn't in danger. Chayla b'miksa, someone has a minor illness, and someone has a michush. So for today, we're going to just really try to nail down 2 of these classifications: a chayla shesh b'sakana, someone whose life is in danger, and a chayla she'en b'sakana. We're going to try to bring together 4 different sugyas. There's no one simon for medical halacha in Shulchan Aruch, and there's no chelik in Shulchan Aruch. It's really all of it's really an amalgam of many different sugyas. So we're going to try to spend maybe a few minutes on each of these 4 topics. The first is going to be about chayla shesh b'sakana, understanding the attitude that Chazal has for it that we began, but also understanding some of the interesting dinim that are associated with it. The broader topic, which is chayla she'en b'sakana, the status of a child within this whole sugya. And then finally, because most of the applications of the subject really have to do with electricity these days, whether it's calling a doctor or it's using medical equipment, we're going to have to address, at least very quickly, the status of electricity in halacha. Now, obviously, these 4 topics are very broad, but honestly, one of the luxuries of talking to an audience like this is that you guys are all, or many of you are rabbanim in training. Hopefully, these klalim are well received. And this is really just for edutainment. And obviously, you guys will all find your own derech of psak and your derech of interacting with these sugyas. So the vignettes, the cases. So one Friday night, there's a diabetic patient in Brooklyn who realizes that they're out of insulin. What's the best way to proceed? This is Friday night. Their life isn't in danger right now. But over the next 24 hours, there's a possibility that they might develop hyperglycemia. They might, the sugars might be out of range. What are we allowed to do in this case? This is not someone who's in danger, but someone who might be in danger in the future. Next case, a person suffers a migraine on Shabbos. The medication is in the neighbor's house, and unlike in New Haven, where we have a very well accepted Eruv, there's no Eruv in the city. What's this patient allowed to do? Are they allowed to have someone go and bring the medication to them? Is there any recourse that they can have for this migraine? And the last is maybe something that's very relevant for all the parents in the room. A child develops a cough on Shabbos. The doctor recommended a humidifier, but it's not set up yet. What are they allowed to do? How do they deal with this? How are we going to model a humidifier? How are we going to model a cough? All right. To get to the first topic of Sakana. So the sugya really starts in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says very, very clearly that you're allowed to Michal Shabbos for a Sakana, for someone whose life is in danger. The Gemara tries to wrestle with this because on the one hand, we know how important Shabbos is to the Jewish psyche. If you keep Shabbos well, all your averos are all your sins are forgiven. If the whole Bnei Yisrael kept two Shabbos, and we'd all have personal as well as cosmic redemption. So how do we model this in terms of values? So Shimon Menachem says, quoting the same pasuk that inspired the Arachaim that we learned before, Sham Bnei Yisrael Shabbos, Amar Torah. He's quoting a pasuk, but this is really a svara. He says that it's as if the Torah is telling you, be mechal one Shabbos, so that just on a utilitarian level, this person will be able to keep many Shabbos. So in other words, the rationale is you want to be able to maintain Shabbos in the future. You need to mechal Shabbos in this case, so this patient will in the future be able to experience many more Shabbos. Rav Yehuda says, name is Shmuel. If I was there, that's to say, if I was in the base measures when this conversation was being had, I would have said a much better limud. And limud he said was v'chai b'hem, v'loy shiamas b'hem. The Torah says, it's said by Shabbos, but really is talking about all mitzvahs, that mitzvahs should be kept in a way that brings chayim to the world, brings life to the world, never in a way that risks life. So in other words, Shmuel has a much broader definition of that it's not just on a utilitarian level, whether this will work, whether this will work. According to Shimon Menachem, you might have to make the calculation whether or not there's going to be a good chance of saving a life, right? So in a case of end-of-life care, Shimon Menachem might not have something to say. Another edge case, Shimon Menachem's limud wouldn't really help us with this with a fetus, someone who's not technically chayav to keep Shabbos right now, but or actually reverse that. The chai behem wouldn't help with that. So we do end up needing both of these limudim. As to say, the chai behem wouldn't apply to a fetus because the fetus is not technically alive. But then Shabbos achas k'dei Shabbos saber would apply. So anyways, both of these limudim are taken by the Rishonim as well as the Achronim in their actual psak. Shulchan Aruch qualifies this a little bit further, right? So now we need obviously the first question is what level of risk justifies a person being mechal Shabbos. So Shulchan Aruch elaborates that if you heard that there's a mapolis, there's a building that fell down, you're not sure if there's any survivors, you're not sure, and if there's survivors, you don't know if they're going to be Jewish or not Jewish. The halacha is that no matter how many sfeikos you can add to this question, you're mechal Shabbos, and you take apart the building so you can potentially save a life there. Af b'shish kama sfeikos, even there's many sfeikos. To explore this, what level of risk justifies Chol Shabbos a little bit more. There's a beautiful. Yeah. Not yet, right? So we're gonna get there. So to try to explore what index of risk would justify Chol Shabbos, there's an interesting question posed to Reb Moshe Feinstein. The question was a very, very binary question. What level of fever would a patient need to have to be Mechal Shabbos for them? The questioner was Aaron Jacobs, no relation. So he elaborates, says that there's no clear. This is on page 3. He says that there's no clear definition here. And it doesn't need to be absolutely clear to you that there is a sakana. The al safek nam mechalim, because even if it's just a safek sakana, it's just you're concerned that there is a risk to life, that justifies Chol Shabbos. And as long as you, the individual, the moral agent in the situation, you're worried about this, right? So I don't need to give you 100.2. I don't need to give you any actual temperature. I don't need to give you a clinical criteria. As long as you are worried, you don't need to have extensive medical training. As long as you're worried, that justifies the Chol Shabbos. Rishon Zalman Auerbach has a similar approach, but he really importantly also qualifies when this wouldn't apply. So he says, so the Kal Rishon, the first cloud when it comes to Shabbos, when it comes to Chayla, Chayshesh, Sakana, or even if there's the smallest, most minute risk to life, you're Mechal Shabbos. So he says, but we need to have a limiting criteria here. So the limiting criteria that he has is that we all have risks to life in general. We all go through life and we have to figure out when to respond. So he says that as long as on a regular day you would have acted, engaged with healthcare in that moment, that justifies it. So in other words, if on Sunday if on Sunday you would have given it a few hours, you weren't overly concerned, don't be overly concerned till Shabbos. You can wait for Shabbos to go out. If on Sunday you would have acted immediately and you would have gone to a doctor, maybe you would have called 911, at that point you're not allowed to ask questions. You have to immediately engage with healthcare. So in his words, if on a regular day, on any of the other days of the week, you would have waited a couple hours, until the doctor opened, or at Baker until the morning, because you wouldn't want to get your family out of bed. Azba Shabbos, then you would also have to act that way, comport yourself the same way on Shabbos. All right. So far we've learned that there is a not only you're allowed to Michal Shabbos for Kollel, but you have a chiyuv too, in the way the Mechaber phrased it. We also learned that it doesn't need to be a vadai risk to life, right? Your best approximation, in other words, your subjective assessment of the situation is enough. And we also learned the limiting criteria, right? The limiting criteria here, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, is that you need to be honest with yourself and ask yourself, what would I do if it was a regular day? If it's a regular day and you engage with care immediately, then on Shabbos you should as well. That being said, even with the Chayei Shesh Sakana, there's a bit of nuance when it comes to derech hapsak between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. And the way this is traditionally thought of, even though in modern poskim it's not as clear, it's a machlokes between the Mechaber and the Ramah, amongst other opinions. So going back to Shin Chav Ches, this is Halacha Yud Beis, quoting the Mechaber, Shemachal and Shabbos, we work very hard to do everything through a Yid, not through anyone who's not Jewish, and not through Ketanim, and not through Rimmon. In other words, the idea here is that you shouldn't try to punt this off to someone who it's going to be lesser of an Isra for, right? Someone who's not Jewish, they're not Shabbos obliged. So the Svar would be, Rosh would allow them to do it. So the Mechaber speaks very much against this. He says the mitzvah is through Yisur Gedolim Bnei Das, whoever, in other words, is the more responsible moral agent. It's their responsibility to also take care of this. So you can't say I'm holier than thou and therefore you should do the Yisur to save this life. Adrabah, he says that the person who feels that they have the most moral agency in that moment has the responsibility to act. The Rama doesn't completely disagree, but he says yeshemrim. That if provided that being mimayit the isser, that minimizing the level of isser that's done comes without any postponement through a shinui, that's to say through doing something in a non-normative way, so it doesn't engage a deraisa function on Shabbos, or through someone who's not Jewish, as long as it doesn't cause any any delay, then we should do this. And that's what we do. Yeah, right. That would be the idea. And so he if you look through the Makaris, he's actually quoting a sugi by Yom Kippur that if someone's very sick on Yom Kippur and you've got a few options of what to feed him, you're going to do hakal kal tchila. You're not going to go straight to a bucket of lard, right, which has many yisurim associated with it on Yom Kippur. You're going to go through the lightest yisur, right? You're going to try to do shiurim. So he says the same rationale would apply to Shabbos. That you're going to try hakal kal tchila. You're going to try to minimize the yisur as much as possible. So if you can have someone who's not Shabbos obliged, then you ask them. If that doesn't work, you do a shinui, right? Yeah, so this is what you'll find is called Hutra versus Dechuya. So according to the Mechaber, Shabbos is Hutra, right? That's to say, just imagine it's Sunday. According to the Ramah, it's Dechuya. It's not ideal that you're pushing off Shabbos, but you're still pushing off Shabbos. It still is Shabbos, and so it's your moral prerogative to minimize the Isser as much in a second. This is going to be very much in line with that. But just to go to the Be'er Halacha, the Be'er Halacha on the Siman. So he clarifies something. So here you might say, if it's Dechuya, now you're going to start thinking about many other kind of qualifications. Does the patient really need it? Can I help in some other way? And so he highlights that the burden of proof is to say that the patient doesn't need it. So in other words, you need to be able to prove in this situation that it's not going to aid in the patient's care. Even according to the people who are going to be machmir here, like the Ramah. You have to be completely certain that by not providing these isurim or this level of healthcare, that you're not going to change the clinical outcome. But if there's equipoise, if you're not sure, Right? So if you have any equipoise, if you're unsure whether or not this action is gonna benefit or not benefit the patient, you need to be the way the Briskers quoted this. You need to be machmir with pikuach nefesh. It's not that we're being mekel by Shabbos, we're being machmir with pikuach nefesh. So the burden of proof is really to prove that you don't need it. And just to highlight, you need to have a lot of clinical training to really say when something is not. Proving a negative is much more difficult, and that's the burden. The burden of proof to prove the negative, according to the Ber Halacha, is on you in that case. Now to quote the Alter Rebbe, So he says, "V'ikar kisvara harishayna." The alpha became admitting with the same kisvara achrayna. Right. So even though that technically the real svara is the way the Mechaber wrote it, still our minig as Ashkenazim is to follow the Ramah. But in one way, we have to be very careful not to follow the Ramah. We're going to see that you're only helping this patient through someone who isn't Shabbos obliged. And then in the future, people are going to say, you know what, I'm going to have to keep my hands clean of this. If there's no guy, this patient might get delayed care on Shabbos. This is quoting the rationale of the Taz, who says this sort of thing as well. So according to the Alter Rebbe, the thing you would be allowed to do is use a shinei. The thing you would not you'd be allowed to do is ask a guy for help. So in this case, the Alter Rebbe would say that you'd have to do it through Gedei Yisrael. The only thing is, he'd say that you needed to use a shinei, and that's kind of the way at least in Shulchan Aruch Harav that he paskins. The prophylaxis. So our case, the case of the diabetic, their life isn't in danger right now. Right now they're euglycemic, right? They're in a good range with their blood sugar levels. So how do we model halachically someone whose life is potentially going to be in danger in the future? So the case that comes to mind, and the pasuk can bring down is Akim Shetzar al Yeres Yisrael Im Baal Isik Mamin In Chalan Shabbos Baal Isik Nefashis Afilu Stam Yitzim Malim Bechlizayin Mechalim Shabbos. So if there's a city that's in danger, if you have certainty that the enemy force only wants financial gain, then the halacha is that you'd have to allow them in, and you wouldn't be able to fight them on Shabbos. If you thought there's a chance that they're after that they present a risk to life, then you have to fight them on Shabbos. And a city that is on the border, even if they only came for financial reasons, halacha is you have to michal the Shabbos for them. And the Ramah elaborates, even if they're not there yet, that's to say, even though there's no present risk, but there's a risk in the future, even there you need to have a show of force to make sure that you prevent any future group of people to come. So the Mishnah Berurah elaborating on that, he says, when there's a rumor that they're coming or that they want to come, even though they haven't engaged their forces yet, you have to make a show of force that they shouldn't be incentivized to come. Because you're not going to make such a strong set of criteria for pikuach nefesh. You can't be too careful. So in other words, back to this idea of Shem Yisrashal, even the lowest index of suspicion, like you're illustrating by Crown Heights, really is enough of a reason to engage the svara of Shem Yisrashal. So in Psak, even it really does seem inherently a little more subjective, and I guess every Rav really needs to follow his intuition when it comes to setting a community standard. Which possibly explains the difference in psak stylistically amongst different communities. Okay, just to apply this to medical halacha, bring the Shmir Shabbos Gilchasa. This is a case that should perhaps be a little bit more intuitive for all of us because we kind of lived through the last pandemic. So he said if there's an infectious agent that someone in the house is infected by, the halacha is that person would be allowed to take a car and drive out to quarantine themselves so not to get other people sick. And the reverse would also be true. So in other words, even if it's a prophylactic case, that itself is a risk enough on Shabbos, even though there is no risk to life presently. To avoid risks to life, you would also be allowed to Michal Shabbos. So going back to our patient who has diabetes, the halacha would be, obviously, as Ashkenazim, we'd have to minimize this as much as possible. But the halacha would be is that they'd have to go buy insulin because eventually, whether it's that night or the next day, they might develop a complication associated with their diabetes, and they would need insulin. So therefore, in that moment, even though their life is not in danger, the halacha is that they would have to go.
But here's the example where getting a guy was probably not being strapped to less love it, right?
There's so many ways in getting a guy, asking a guy to order an Uber, meaning there's so many ways to minimize the sisser.
It's clear at that point that that even the goy option would be an option we would accept because it doesn't negate Shemitah.
Not only accept, that's the way we would have to paskin, because as Ashkenazim we are bound by this idea of a kalkat tefillah.
Why that the you by goy? Because by going driving, penalty doesn't work, and here for sure it would work.
For sure. All right. Okay, so now pivoting. So now we kind of dealt with the contours of the first sugya. Now we're going to pivot to the next sugya, defining what a chayil she'en b'sakana is and how we model this halacha. So there's two beautiful gemaras that a lot of the conversation is pinned on. There's many others, but these are two of them. The first is in Ksubis Samach Amud Aleph. Tanya Someone who's genach, someone who has a bad cough. Genach is kind of a hard thing to define. It would seem that they would either have some sort of cardiac source of their cough. If you look at many different makars, that's kind of what it sounds like. And there's an interesting study that I found from Bar Ilan that would perhaps support that. So there's a virus called Coxsackie virus that causes cardiomyopathy. Maybe that's something that's associated with this. So genach, because sometimes it's called genach mikav lev. So there's an interest. What is this genach? It's kind of hard to define. So my time, so the person who's genach is allowed to suckle directly from a goat on Shabbos. Why? Because yonik is mefarik lachayad. You're separating in a non-normative way. In a case of pain, right? Not defining risk. In a case of pain, legaz rabbanan. So chum in this case, they weren't afraid for the life of the person. They were just afraid of tsar. And in that case, you'd be allowed to do this derabanan. You're allowed to do a derabanan. You do a deraisa, in other words, there's a tremendous machlokes whether this would have been a deraisa to begin with, and that kind of colors a lot of the opinions that come after that. That's to say, you're allowed to do derabanan for a case of tsar, and it's not that it's not that you're violating a halacha derabanan. There's no derabanan there to begin with. Ameimar. This is in Mesechus Be'ah. You're allowed to color your eye on Shabbos. So just to highlight what this means, that there was this thing called mikchal, which seemed to be some sort of a paste that they use cosmetically as well as for medicine. Now mikchal had some property to it that if someone had eye pain, whatever that eye pain was, it would alleviate some of that eye pain. So Meimar said that even though you're not allowed to color, because teveya, putting on makeup, teveya on your skin would be an issa deraisa. But for refuah, you're allowed to have a guy do it. There's another way the conversation goes, and just in this other iteration of the conversation, Ula says, any needs for a chayla, you can do it through someone who's not Shabbos obliged on Shabbos. Okay, so that's the call. So you have two column here. One, that you can engage with derabanan because makam sala goes rabbanan, and the other, in a similar vein, because everything in similar nachar is only asur derabanan on Shabbos. Then you'd be allowed to engage the services of someone who's not Jewish on Shabbos, because kol davar shein b'sakana omer l'gevesa. Trying to define this, that's to say, what sort of a sermon are you allowed to do? So there's no real argument when it comes to Mir L'Nachri. The argument happens when it comes to doing a Maisa. So as we're going to see, there's uncharacteristically, there's three opinions brought in the Mechaber. There's four opinions that's brought in the Mechaber. We end up asking like a Svara Shlishis. Now, what's interesting in the intrigue here is that there's a tremendous machlokes what the Svara Shlishis is, as we're going to see. Now, the two relevant opinions are going to be the Ramban and the Rashba. The Ramban ends up being, I think, the first opinion that's quoted in Shulchan Aruch, and the Ramban is the third. There's machlokes how to learn the Ramban, but just to learn these opinions inside, the Ramban is quoted from the Teres Adam, Shar Mechush. So he says, this is how you elaborate, this is how you explain this whole sugya. Any pain that a person has, provided that he's neifel mishkav, that he can't function, and he ends up having to go to bed because he's in so much pain. You're allowed to do a shvus, you're allowed to do something that's asur derabanan that doesn't have a maisa. Dahainu, what is that shvus? What is something that's asur derabanan but doesn't have an active component to it? That's to say, amir lagai, because you're really only engaging something with your speech. You're asking someone who's not Jewish, who's not chayv in Shabbos, to do something on Shabbos, and that would be allowed. V'chein, another additional heter that Chum gave us. And this is kind of where we're going to see a tremendous machlokes in how you read this. You're allowed to do something that's asur derabanan. The malacha says shvus of a malacha hanasas b'sheni. The shvus of a malacha hanasas b'sheni can be read two ways. One, you're allowed to do a derabanan, but the derabanan has to be done with a sheni. In other words, shvus to malacha. It's only a malacha that's only asur derabanan, but that you do with a sheni. The other way to read it is that you're allowed to do a Shabbos. What's a Shabbos? What's Shabbos in this context? Malacha hanasa b'shinei, a malacha that's done with the shinei. All right, so the tremendous difference in psak here. So on the one hand, you're allowed to do a deraisa with a shinei. On the other hand, you'd only be allowed to do a rabbanan with a shinei. Going to the Rashba, this is in Shabbos Trips of the Rashba Chel Gimel, Simin Reisha and Beis, going down to the bottom. He said, "Dvarim she'ein behen el is drabanan oisin al yidein v'afil Yisrael." Something that's only us drabanan, you're allowed to do a drabanan without a shinei, according to the Rashba. So according to Ramban, you'd be allowed to do a shvus to melach nas b'shinei. So we're going to explore what that means in a second. And according to the Rashba, you're allowed to do a drabanan without a shinei. And these opinions are brought down to the Shulchan Aruch. He adds there are a few other opinions that are also brought down, but in the bolded in Shin Chav Ches and Simin Yud Zayin, even if someone's only a chel she'ein b'sakana, you'd be allowed to do a drabanan without any shinui. V'yesh emrim she'im ein b'sakana sever oisim b'shinui v'im yesh b'sakana sever oisim b'lo shinui. V'divrei asvar shlishis nirin. The opinion of the third opinion is taken, meaning the third opinion of the Ramban is taken. So here we have a machlokes. According to the Mishnah Berurah and many other literature paskim, you'd only be allowed to do, according to the Svar Shlishis, a drabanan with a shinei. So in other words, you'd have to find something that itself is a drabanan, and that you'd only be allowed to do the shinei. According to the Alter Rebbe, just to go to the bolded on in Shivchachas Sif Yates, by the shinei muter lasses a film malacha gemara. Elaborating what the Svar Shlishis the Mechaber is, a shinei you would even allow you to do a complete malacha, meaning malacha deraisa. K'gein hagineach shemuter leinak befiv k'may shispar shekem shemashana basiyas ein asur el b'divrei sefer. All right. Genech, back that Gemara, the Gemara in Ksubis that we quoted, that someone who can suckle from a goat. The suckling from a goat. So it turns out there's antiviral properties to goat milk before it's pasteurized. So perhaps, and this was illustrated by a great story from Bar-Ilan. I could send in the chat a little later. Yeah, seems is very much in vogue. But I will say that it seems that when kids get HSV on their lips, I did see a lot in Williamsburg working there that they send them to the tzigalach, they send them to the goats upstate, and they seem to actually work. So I can't argue against. There's a good basic scientific reason for it. I haven't seen any clinical data about it, but it seems empirically that it does work. So they didn't go as they weren't. So they take it as long as it's not pasteurized. That seems to work. The clinical efficacy of suckling directly from the goat may be impeded by the fact that it's very hard to get a kid to suckle, or a kid or anybody to really suckle from a goat. So I guess there's that's also something I've heard of. These are all reasons that I didn't go into pediatrics, so this works out. So the Ksasa Shulchan to try to explain what's the svara here, right? So what's the svara that you're allowed to do the rest of the shrunei, but you wouldn't be allowed to do a derabanan be a dayim, right? Why are we passing like the svara shlishis? Even according to Alter Rebbe, it seems a little bit plead, right? It seems a little bit strange. If you're going to take this idea that you need to minimize the chilul of Shabbos, what does it matter if you're doing a regular derabanan to be a dayim or you're doing the deraisa with the shrunei? It seems to be doing the same thing. So Ksasa Shulchan brings a really interesting svara that I think really highlights the svara Chazal in general. He says that in this moment, we have two issues. One, that the person's in pain, and we need to minimize that pain as much as possible, because if they're in pain, they can't experience Shabbos. If they can't experience Shabbos, remember we said Shabbos is a phenomenon that happens when you have a Yid and Shabbos together. This Yid isn't experiencing Shabbos. On a Derabanan level, we want to try to make sure they can experience Shabbos as much as possible. On the other hand, we can't have a habit formation that you're going to do Derabanan later. So in a way, we're pitted between this Shabbos, experiencing this Shabbos, and compromising the experience of Shabbos and other Shabbosim. Therefore, he says you're allowed to do Deraisa as long as they're the Shinui, it's not going to be habit forming. The Shinui is so it's so involved to do, you're not going to get into the habit of doing the Shinui. So therefore, we pass on like the Svar Shlishis. It's interesting to point. It's important to point out though when it comes to psak, and I asked a few about Rabbanim if we're curious. This Mishnah Berurah quotes the Chai Adam. The Chai Adam says that practically, if there's a real need for it, paskim do seem to also paskin like the Rashba, like the other Shitta. The Chai Adam brings this down. Yisrael mutter dafka de shine, Chai Adam masik sheim afsher b'shine mutter b'lo shine. And it seems that it really depends on the needs of the situation. Yes, to do derabanan with a shini, right? To do derabanan with a shini, people pass on like the other opinion as well. It does also make sense. It seems like they're all gradations of what's acceptable psak. That's why the Chaver brings all of them. The second deraisa. The second would be derabanan. The question is milking a goat directly? Let's say you were wasting it in another way. Is that going to be deraisa? And that's a question I'm sure you guys have much more to say about than I do. No, it's a derabanan if you're suckling from a goat because that's mefarik kalachayad. Because you're doing it there, something that would be a deraisa if you did it in a normative way. That's to say, if you were milking directly, it would have been a deraisa. Since you did it in a non-normative way, it's a derabanan.
That's similar as a shina, I guess.
That is a shina. That's what we're saying.
So if it's a shina, then it says that you're allowed to do a deraisa with a shina. How can it be shigure or whatever non-different?
So he learns the Svar Shlishis very differently. He says they have to do derabanan.
No, I have to take him where.
So why would it be different according to him to deraisa?
Some people learn that case is clear. The question is, that case might be a double derabanan. That case might have other there, or there might be greater tsar over there, the farm or mako. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that are given for that case.
Yeah, listen, Ksibis is Shas Katan, so it's not the Yeshiva Shemesech this year? Yeah, okay, great. All right. Okay, so now to go into the next topic. So we just did Kollel She'em B'Sakana. So it's getting long. But now to get into the next topic, which I think is very pertinent for all parents, is how do we model the needs of children? The needs of children is a sugi that's very much reliant on this subject of defining what a Kollel She'em B'Sakana is. So the Gemara highlights that's to say you're allowed to carry a child, and as you're carrying the child, they're also holding a rock. That'd be either muksa, depending on how you read the Gemara, that could be real isser. It's not an isser to hold the child because he's a chaynes atzmei, but it'd be an isser to hold the rock. But it'd be holding in a non-normative way. So halacha would be over there that you can hold your child because the emotional well-being of the child is something that the Gemara has believes that there's a medical reason to pursue that. And therefore you're allowed to carry them. There's another Gemara. So the child's holding the rock. He's gakagoim. The rock is calming him down, and so you're carrying him with the rock, even though it's not ideal. Halach would be you'd be allowed to do that in that case. The Gemara Yavamas also highlights a case that the normal practice according to Abba Shaul was that kids would going back to the goats, they would suckle from the goats directly on Yom Tov. That was a normal practice. In other words, that's an issue d'Rabbanan. But since the kids needed milk, they'd be allowed to do it, and that was a normal practice on their week to week. Explaining kind of the rationale here, this is borrowed from the Sugi by Yom Kippur. So he says, anything that allows for the growth, for the thriving of children, there's no gzera d'Rabbanan on it. If the child's cold, you're allowed to tell the non-Jew to turn on a fire, even on Shabbos. All right. So this is the din that's quoted by the Rama, but it's quoted very, very cryptically. As we're going to see, there's two real ambiguities that we need to really explore when addressing this Rama. So he says that you're allowed to ask someone who's not Jewish to prepare food quoting really this din from the Isser B'Hater. You're allowed to ask him to make food for a child on Shabbos and this is going to be one of the sources for ambiguity because he says this line that in general the needs of children is like Kollel She'em B'Sakana. So the two questions that we need to ask ourselves, and the Alter Rebbe really quotes a very similar lashon. Two ambiguities are: first, what's a katan? What's the age criteria for defining someone as a katan? And then the second is, how far do we take this idea of tzarchei katan? Which tzarchei? The only cases that we really have are this din about food, which there are quotes here. There's another one that you're allowed to open the door for a child, break the door, or even turn off a candle, or for the child if it's causing them emotional distress. That could be pikuach nefesh. This gaguin etzlav could also potentially, if you're going to read it that way, be pikuach nefesh as well.
Yeah, traditional way is not. These repairs, traditional medicine.
But still, what does stam tzarich chayil shnei v'sakana? And going back to the Isra v'heter, he says immediately ispe rebusli nuka, right? Something that allows for the thriving a child. It seems to be a much more broad understanding than just food. And understandably, because of these ambiguities, perhaps there's many different opinions of how do we deal with this. The Chazon Ish and Shabbos Arbach have a very minimized version of this. The Chazon Ish, I believe, only says you're allowed to make food, but no other needs, explaining that it's manafshach. If the child needs food, then it's shesh b'sakana, right? If it's really going to starve, it's basically children, as we all know, are not going to eat something that they don't want to eat. And so you're allowed to make them a food that they're going to eat if otherwise there's food available. If they're really starving, they'd eat it. You're allowed to make them food because that's rebus le'nuka. But the age there, they say, is really only till about 3. They look at this language of Yanuka, someone who's a suckling, right? Someone who's not yet weaned, as to maybe going until within their second year until 3. Makes sense. It's a very logical way to look at this again. The Minchas Yitzchak says until the age of 9. And he really lumps it into the rest of the dinim by Yom Kippur, that the child really only starts to have a responsibility to keep certain dinim by Yom Kippur by the age of 9. Because and that would also make sense with the way the later paskim address this. They say tzarchei katan. They don't take this lashon of Yenuka. They say katan. Now katan can be to a younger age. Shabbos Arbach, like I said, falls more like the Chazon Ish. And Tzitz Eliezer said, maybe until the age of 6, right? Until he's a tzinik tzarech le'imei. All right, so there's many different approaches to this. Shemish Hilchos relies on Reb Chaim Nah from Ksasa Shulchan, and he says it's really until 9 or 10, but it really all depends on your assessment as to the needs of the child. There's certain children that are more needy than others, as we can all see, and so the children that are more needy, you have to make a real shikol adas here. It could be not only food, but also things that are associated with their well-being in other contexts. All right, so now. Then we have the basic principles. We went to sheyesh b'sakana. We elaborated that prophylaxis, that's to say, acting before.
It seems like it's something saying that the Gemara is really teaching us the reality, not telling us the din. Or this concept, which is that you might not pay attention to the needs of the child, you might not recognize the significance, therefore pay more attention, and therefore therefore it's all based on the seers. It's still with this chazon shemalash, it just takes more thought. No?
There's a few different ways to read it, but from what I remember down in the Badei Shulchan, he really says it's very much yeah. So I guess that's one. So you're saying that the Chazon Ish looks at it much more fundamentally, and
they both look at the same. The Minchas Yisrael looks so differently, but the Chazon Ish and Shulchan both go to the term how this parents not telling us a kiddush or a din. That you treat every katan like a kiddush and rather a katan is a kiddush and which is circuit katanim are significant. They can make them sick if you don't take care of them.
So why does it seem like the Chazon Ish is stricter about the age?
They just in this realm, Chazon Ish says, if you want to make a klal and say all circuit katan, that klal that a child is like a vegetable katan only applies till 3, and that's true. Comes Ksasa says, yeah, obviously a klal across the board is that age, but practically, it could be in many cases that it goes up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever. So
it's a shikol adas and not a disagreement.
That's for the variation.
So it seems that especially for us as a Lubavitcher time, not
ask each other to both agree.
Right.
Okay, I understand every 2-year-old is a fetish sakana, but I have a 7-year-old that's very needy. Would reply, and he doesn't eat so much, and he gets weak. He said, yeah, and he asked the shofan. Does it apply to every? And
he'd also say,
does it apply to every 2-year-old? It's 100% every 2-year-old. Sure, it applies.
Maybe when you're giving a shiur, it's nice to have a clean break, but there are other cases where this also gets engaged. The mental health of a child. Let's say a child has a certain type of autism, and the only way that they can be calmed is through a car ride to go to sleep. The Shabbos Arbach passings over there that you're allowed to ask an Andrew to drive them. You're even allowed to join them in the car if that's going to. So there are many other nafkaminas that are associated with this. So it's definitely not just associated with food. And it does seem that the paskim have a broader understanding of this. It really depends more on the needs of the child, obviously, than the contours of the sugya itself. All right. So since most of these sugyas really will touch on electricity, it's worth just talking about it very briefly, even though this could be a whole nother 45 minutes. The paskim in the 19th century had a tremendous set of rationales to try to make electricity aser. there was this feeling, right? And I don't think this feeling is something we trifled with, but there's a feeling that electricity is definitely not allowed on Shabbos. How? We're not totally sure. Now the problem with that is that there's a beautiful Teres Yisrael that he says shekol davar shelo nida tam la'asrei muter hubli tam. Right? Anything that you can't say positively is aser should be allowed, because the Torah is telling you what's aser. The Torah is not going to tell you everything that's muter. The Torah would be an impossibly long document if it's going to tell you every permutation. So it's a different legal philosophy, perhaps, than what we're experienced with in the Haredi world. I don't know how him and the Chasam Sefer, who says Chadash Hashem Torah, would really relate to each other, but yeah,
not really a Balashkafa in many ways in terms of.
So it's an interesting line, right? So meaning the line really will say that to ask. Yes, it's a good psicha. It's a good psicha. It's a good line to quote. So there are many rationales that were given. Why is electricity aser? So the Beis Yitzchak says, Shmalkas, he was one of the first to write on the subject. He says it's aser because of mileage. That's to say, you're creating something new. You're creating a new function. Therefore, it should be aser. Obviously, it'd be aser d'Rabbanan. Chazon Ish says no, it's really aser d'Oraisa. Sometimes he says because of Baina, or sometimes he says because of Makabeh Patish, depending on how you're gonna really wrestle with the sugis. That's to say, when I close the circuit, I'm creating a new flow of electricity. I'm creating a new function. So that's Baina. That being said, even if it's not real Baina, or I'm finishing something off, I'm finishing off a function utility, and then it'd be Makabeh Patish. So you have these two trends of thought. The Shabbos Zalman Auerbach really, as a very, very young man, his first kind of opening to the wider rabbinic world was in a kuntres that he wrote about electricity. It's very long. It's a very beautiful read. But just to quote Michal Shleima Chelik Aleph, he has two simanim over there that deal with it, and Yud Aleph and Tes. So he really breaks down each of the svaras to be Iser, highlighting how there isn't a good legalistic reason for them to apply to electricity. So by Moilid, he says Moilid's a very amorphous isser, and we can really only use it for what the Chachamim already told us we can use it for. So say talking to the Beis Yitzchak, you can't convince me that on a legalistic level Moilid should apply. That's his critique of Moilid. From Makabeh Patish and for Baina, he says that there's a difference between Baina and Ishtamshus. And turning on and off a light is clearly Ishtamshus. Now, it's important to highlight that, let's say, our lights, which are LEDs, you can use this far. But that's not to say that you can't use electricity to do real Isser Deraisa. Meaning, if I turn on electricity with an incandescent bulb, no one's going to argue that I'm being Maver. This is an Isser Deraisa. It's an important distinction to make. So, Malchayik by printing. If I press print, am I doing kaisiv, or is it not kaisiv? Moshe says it's not kaisiv. Most other poskim say that's kaisiv. A computer screen would not be kaisiv in that case. It wouldn't be engaging with a other malacha process because it's transient. It's not the way ksiva happens. It's just an electrical set of lights. So there's many other associated sugyas with this. A modern opinion is trying to wrestle with the same issue as Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss has a very interesting take on it. Quoting Gemara Yerushalmi, he highlights that Rabbi Yechon and Rish Lakish were sitting and they were trying to figure out the different isurim, and anything that they felt was aser, or they had a tradition that was aser, they couldn't find a direct comparison to Malachas Mishkan. They throw it into Makabeh Patish, that you're finishing something off, and that was their decision to make. And that's where Rav Asher Weiss says that electricity is clearly Makabeh Patish, not vis-a-vis the way the Chazon Ish interpreted it, but us as a klal, we can say that this is definitely something that's finishing. So it's like a deraisa. Now, I will say that when it comes to healthcare in general, Rav Asher Weiss told us that it was that you can definitely rely on Shabbos Zalman Auerbach. He didn't say just when the Sheyesh B'Sakana. He says in general for healthcare needs you can rely on the age old opinion of Shabbos Zalman Auerbach. All right, so common applications. Now we can go back to our original case. If a child develops a cough on Shabbos, the humidifier is connected but not set, is there a way to set it up? So according to all that we've learned, if they have a cough, that's clearly your bisli nuka, you'd be able to turn on ideally with a shinai. The electricity wouldn't be that much of a barrier. Checking a fever, if it's an electric thermometer, you should probably have not an analog thermometer at home, but checking a fever would also be allowed to do this with electricity. Calling a doctor, you should try to use a shinai. But we're going to model this as a d'Rabbanan. And modeling as d'Rabbanan, you'll be able to do it with the shinai. And if you really can't, for some reason, you can do it also like the Rashba says. But it all really depends on the needs. Other things that come up generally.